Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics.
Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Carl Carlson.
And this is Fred Schrenkler. Hey, Carl.
Hey, Fred. You know, we really enjoyed our last podcast where we did a sort of a deep dive in that first step of the six-step process on developing a reliability strategic vision. And I thought maybe let's just do this in sequence and talk about the core principles on performing a reliability gap assessment. You know, it's not automatically intuitive. Sometimes so we have the vision, we know where we want to go. Why don't we just lay out the steps to go there? Why do you think we need a gap assessment as the next step?
Well, I'm going to build on Chris's analogy of if you're going to get in your car and you ask how much gas I need. Well, now I know I'm going to go down to the grocery store, right? So I don't need a lot of gas. And I could just jump in the car and go, right? But there's also, especially the weather that I've been having this winter, it's prudent to actually check the map to go, oh, okay, well, that road's closed and that road's washed out and that one's under repair and there's a tree across that one, which is not exaggerating what I saw on one of the storms we had out here. And so it was, if I know where I'm going, and I don't know what my capabilities are in a road trip thing is what roads are open, for example. I may be surprised along the way if I say, just jump in the car and go and the tire's not attached.
Okay.
I'm looking at it that way, is that it's part of it is setting up a contrast or the idea of not only constraints, but capabilities of your team and organization. You might say, we want to be best in the world, but if we don't know what that is or how to do that, that could be a real problem of actually achieving it. So it's a step to get a picture of what we know and don't know and what we're capable of and not capable of, is a way to help make sure that you're going to get there. Achieve the vision.
That's good. That's a good reply. And let me build on the analogy one more step here that comes to mind. I've done, my wife and I've done a lot of RVing. Mm-hmm. And when we did long trips, we had to ask ourselves, if we're going through Texas or places where there's not a lot of gas stations, and I don't even want to go into the electric area right now because that's just sort of forming on the subject of RVs. But we often didn't have enough gas because the tank is not big enough. I mean, you could design your trip around gas station to gas station. Mm-hmm. But so we ended up getting a external fuel tank so we could go a day's worth of driving and not have to be subservient or dependent on the gas station location. And so that analogy fits a lot of things. The gap in that example helped me understand what were the shortcomings of my RV system in terms of what our goals are to travel the country and see the national parks and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. We're going to be in some pretty remote areas. So what are the gaps? Well, just having enough fuel or having enough capability is part of it.
Yep.
And that brings me to so if you have a strategic vision, like we talked about in the last podcast, and you know where you want to be in terms of, let's say, beating the competition or that type of thing, well, now you have to sit back and say, where are we today?
Yeah.
How good are we today?
Yeah, I mentioned that one group that wanted to be best, and how much better do they need to be? And says, well, you're asking the right question because you need to be better, because there was surveys out, national surveys, and showing that you were pretty much perceived as the worst product out there considering quality and reliability. So you got a long way to go. It's just, you only have one way to go. It's better. But if you don't know where you are, and it's the same with any kind of consulting or coaching of any kind, you bring up a new soccer team and you get the season started and say, all right, go play. and you assess how well are they at passing, how are they at vision on the screen, are they talking to each other. So as a coach, it's like, well, where are you now? Because I'm not going to teach them how to kick the ball and make a pass if they're already doing it really well. But maybe
Right.
they're not communicating well with each other. Maybe they're not spreading out enough with each other. And says, well, those are the opportunities to take you to the next level. Let's build on what you're good at and improve what you're not so good at. But if you don't do that practice drill to see where they're at, you don't know what to work on.
Yeah. And this requires keeping a vision in mind. Let's say uh, you have certain tools that you think you would use, like FMEA or HALT or other tools.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the gap assessment is knowing what the capability is today. So how do you envision using how good are you? I'm sorry, at a HALT. In other words, do you have the capability today? So you have to start asking certain questions. And so I've always started a gap assessment by knowing where the vision is and then starting to list out some of the questions that I'm going to have to go explore to see what the current capability is.
Well, it's part capability, but I always looked at that set of interviews and discussions you're having is one, is this organization aligned about what they're trying to do? And if everybody deeply understands the vision and can articulate how what they're doing relates to it, that's a far cry from a team that says, well, we never measure it, so I don't care, and I'm worried about costs, and the next person's worried about time to market, and if they're scattered all over the place, it's a program management problem, it's a cultural problem, but reliability gets churned up in that kind of realm. So part of it is how do they think about implementing reliability? How do they consider the impact on the performance of their product, the reliability performance, with selecting a vendor? It's not so much what I also look at what tools, but I am always cautious. They'll say, oh, we have a HALT chamber. We do it all the time. All right. That's great.
Mm.
But do you actually use that information for anything? Oh, they always complain that we break it. So we're happy generating a report. They pay us for that, but then they don't do anything with it. Now I see a problem.
Yeah, exactly. I remember some of our early conversations when we were developing this book, and you had 4 questions that I thought were really succinct from a method standpoint. In other words, the gaps can be organizational, they can be culture, but they can also be methods.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was like, to what extent do you use a particular method, say HALT?
Right.
And then how do you use it? And then why do you use it?
Yep.
Because you're basically probing to see if they understand that.
Yep.
And then do they have some examples that we can look at about the application of a particular tool? So you had a really nice cadence of exploration on the method side that we've adopted in the book as part of it as well.
Part of it is you really want to, and I was just reviewing a draft book just yesterday, and it came across as, well, here's how you do reliability. Here's a list of tools. Do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and you'll do it. That's doing reliability. And I'm like, no. That's really dangerous. You can keep a team of people very busy doing stuff that may have absolute no worth whatsoever. So instead, it's if you already are doing HALT and you and the organization understands and values it, you may choose not to do it on purpose because you don't need that information. That's way better than, oh, we never use it because it just breaks products. So it's not whether you have the chamber or that you do it all the time. It's how well is it integrated into what information you need to make decisions. And the gap isn't so much, do you have a chamber or not? That it can be expensive to buy one, or you can go rent them, and you can solve that many different ways. The bigger gap is, do you even need to know or use this technique? And do you have the capability to understand the difference?
Yeah, exactly. So you really have to know why you're using or would use this particular tool? What would you do with the information? And then from that, once the gap assessment is done, like you say, we can get into the decisions and then methods. But the gap is part of honing in, zeroing in. For example, let me say what we don't want to do. We don't want to say, okay, I remember this happened in a company I work for. We brought in experts on Taguchi methods, and all the executives went to get trained on Taguchi, and then the orders started coming down. We're going to use Taguchi all the time,
Yep.
and of course that's not the right thing to do, because we don't know. We have to know why you use a Taguchi method versus some other method, and when you use it under certain circumstances, what's the selection criteria, and it would be based on filling some gap or reinforcing something that you've done well. It would not just be automatic. And so one of the things the gap assessment does is it allows you to move away from a template. That's an automatic listing of tools, which we would say is not the right way to go.
Oh yeah, definitely. But part of the gap is the tension between achieving or moving towards the vision, your specific program's goals. This product needs to be XYZ reliable, and what, while you're not already picking out what exactly you need to do, it's a question and a discussion about, well, what are the barriers to us achieving that objective? And it might be, oh, we believe we need a new material that we've never worked with before. Or, that might be an issue that we might want to explore. We have a major decision to pick this material, but we don't have enough information. It doesn't preclude picking an accelerated testing or material study or vendor data or all the other things that you could do to fill in that blank. But it identifies that there's a tension here between we suspect we need a different something from what we have now, and we don't know how to tell if it's better or not. And that to me is the essence of the gap. It's not, do we have a halt chamber or not? No, it's, do we understand how this product will fail? If we really have no idea, well, halt may well be a good way to go about doing it. It's not the only way, but the gap is, do we understand the risks involved with going with this vendor versus that vendor, or this material versus that material? Or do we need to make these kinds of changes to achieve our objectives? Those are the questions that we have to latch on. The other way I've often asked this question in just a summary with, if I only get a few minutes with somebody, well, what keeps you up at night? What gives you the most concern that it could go all wrong? And that almost always elicits a short list of things that lead to, well, if we had better information or better access to the information you need to make a decision, you'd be in good shape. Yeah, that'd be great. That's what I think of as the gap. It's that tension of what we know and don't know, and sometimes is what we don't know, which is kind of fun.
But those are good core principles. I don't think there's a canned list of questions. And in our book, we had identified some example questions.
And then we even have appendix that lists.
Yeah, we have an appendix that you can get online that has more examples. But the point I'm making there is that you don't want to automatically take those. You want to develop your own list of questions based on your strategic vision and based on what you know about your organization. It's really a fact-finding. A gap assessment's like part of it is fact-finding. Where are you today compared to where you need to be?
Yep.
And part of that, where you are today, can be organizational. Like, for instance, if you have lofty goals and lofty visions for reliability, but nobody even has any training in reliability, there's no infrastructure, there's no people, you haven't, then that can be a gap. In other words, there could be an organizational gap.
Yeah, right. Or awareness, or I always think of the the teams that say, well, we don't have a way to do cross-sectioning in a SEM scanning electron microscope, so we can't do failure analysis. And I said, well, that's not actually true.
No.
You don't have to spend $200 million to build a beautiful lab, which would be fun and engaging, and it may well be worth it. But first you need to bridge that gap of what tools are actually useful for you. And there's plenty of labs around that are more than happy to let you play, with their scanning electron microscope or this, that, or the other thing, so you can get good at doing failure analysis, as opposed to,
there's so many, I'm sorry, go ahead.
As opposed to saying, well, we can't do it because we don't have the equipment. No, that's not true. It's the gap is the attitude towards doing failure analysis, the process of doing it, the awareness of how you go about doing it. You can learn the tools and techniques, and you can pick up the assets as they become viable for you. But oftentimes the gap isn't, do I have a chamber or not? It's, do you need a chamber?
Yes. And there's so many solutions, and we don't want to go to the solutions before we understand the gaps. For instance, you may decide to hire people and get them trained, or you may decide to hire people that are already trained or educated in reliability, or you may decide to bring in an outside consultant, or you may decide, like you say, to engage an outside lab, or you may decide there's all types of future decisions, but they should be based on where you are today compared to where you want to be. And that's really what step 2 is about. The other thing I wanted to say about step 2, the performing a reliability gap assessment, is it takes contact. You don't want to do this by yourself, for example, of course.
Yeah.
You want to do this by talking with people. Now, you can talk to people in a big group, or you can talk to people one-on-one. You can talk to people in a meeting. You can talk to people in the hallway. The point is, and just trying to convey the concept, is there's a communication part of this where you need to, with all humility, you don't want to preach when you're doing a gap assessment. You want to listen, and you want to ask questions. So you have to seek out who to talk with, as well as what questions to ask and what type of venue it should be.
No, I found the best person to call is the general manager or the CEO's assistant. Because one of their duties is to deflect tasks away from the boss that other people certainly can handle. And so when I was at Hewlett Packard, my charter was to go do this assessment of all of I called them, and my mentor called them feudal baronies. Each division was its own feudal barony of business, and they were autonomous in many, many regards. So they actually ran different business models. They ran different structures. They did all kinds of weird stuff different. And it was deliberate that each product line would have its own flexibility. And I didn't know vast majority of these people, these organizations. So I would call the general manager's office, and somebody would pick up, and I'd say, hi, I'm Fred. I'm from corporate. I'm coming to take a look at your reliability program. Who do I need to talk to? And it was never the CEO, the general manager.
Which is something.
Well, the general manager is running a $100 million business line, right? And there were a few that wanted to talk to me, but usually it was like their quality director or the director of engineering, or usually a pretty senior person was the go-to. And then they would say, oh, the type of information you're looking for, you need to talk to these 8 people, from this group, that group, this one. They had the position then to invite me to talk to them, and I would get an hour with them. And this is coming from distant, far away corporate, hi, I'm coming to help kind of thing. And so, but I found that if you don't know who to talk to, if you're coming into an organization, you're just new into it, or you're trying to figure out who is the reliability people in this organization. Many organizations don't have a department or a named reliability manager. It's not terribly common. It's out there, but it's not required by anybody.
Right.
So if it's not clear, go ask the general manager's assistant. They will know. That's their job.
Good.
That's a quick, I don't think that's in the book, but that's a tip.
No, good. I like that. A couple things that come to mind here. One is when you're doing a gap assessment, I always want to part of it for me is immersion. So I ask myself, I want to see, how is this organization, this department, this company currently going about achieving reliability?
Yep.
It might be good, it might be bad, whatever, but you want to understand it.
Yep.
And so you're going to want to read whatever procedures or documents. This is in addition to the questioning.
Yep.
So I didn't want to leave people with the idea that it's only questions. Part of it is study and immersing in the in what's currently being done today. Sometimes that's asking questions. Sometimes that's reading. However it is. The other thing I want to mention is the maturity matrix. It's so important to map the gaps. Part of understanding the gaps is, where is the company on the maturity matrix today? Because we're going to want to move the company up the maturity matrix. And if you haven't, if you don't understand maturity matrix, obviously it's in the book. I think it's in chapter 3, where we do a deep dive into maturity matrix. But don't you also have, Fred, an ebook on maturity matrix, don't you?
Yeah. And it's really that it's mapping. It's like, okay, they're good at passing, but they're not so good at shooting on the goal, or they're really good at communicating, but they're confusing each other. And so it's saying, it's a listing of different areas of importance to achieving reliability, and setting goals and doing test and verification type stuff, and failure analysis, and, dealing with failures and stuff like that. It covers all kinds of different things.
Yeah. And this is how you get the culture, because the maturity matrix really is imbued with the culture, as how important reliability is, and that type of thing. And part of that gap assessment is understanding that the culture today, where it is, because we may need to change the culture as part of the reliability planning.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that helps you identify, well, what's holding you back, right? If we're getting no information back from the field, so we're not getting any failure analysis back, or we're not getting any reports back, and we get just warranty numbers, that may be identified as a gap, because you're not getting the feedback mechanism as how well previous products are doing in an engineering sense. And so that may be the pivotal point that's on the matrix, is in retarding the ability for other groups, to other parts of this process, this culture, to make headway. It may be very obvious. Everything's doing great except for this one. And they're bucking against being proactive because they don't have a good view of what happened before. And so
we have it in the book. We talk lots of examples of gaps, because people sometimes say, well, what do you mean by gap? I'll just give one example that comes to mind with me is I worked with a company a few years ago that they were doing testing. They had a warranty that was maybe 10, 12 years. I forget what it was. But they did testing for essentially replicated 1 year, because they assumed that the failure distribution would be level. And so they figure, okay, if we understand what's happening in 1 year, we just multiply it by 10
and we're good
to get the overall. And so a gap can be a wrong assumption. It can be whatever it is.
Yeah. And oftentimes it's communications and how they perceive or use things. And so, if you run a whole pile of activities and it's just a checklist but nobody ever uses it, the gap is not that they do HALT and FMEA and cellular testing, environmental testing, and on and on and on, is that they don't use it. And they're not, so it can run all over the map. But getting a good picture of where you're at, and I'll go back to that soccer analogy, is you get a good picture of what you're good at and not good at. And a prudent thing to do is build on your strengths and limit the parts you're not so good at, improve those, focus on it. And then there's many, many different options depending on what the nature of it is and the overall culture. But until, one of the things I found, Carl, just one last note on this thing, is that going in and doing one of these assessments or appraisals or whatever you call it, it's not an audit. There's no right or wrong answers. You're just trying to understand what's the right word? Gestalt. You're trying to understand how this all works, how people go about doing their business to achieve reliability. And more often than not, and I'm sure it's the same with you, Carl, is that you debrief the organization and what you learned, and they're going, you know more about our organization than we do, because almost nobody sits back and says, what is it that we actually do in a way like this?
It's fun I really enjoy it because you don't know where it's going to end up. There's nothing canned about it.
Yeah.
It's exploratory. You're going to learn things, and the organization learns too. So if you do it right and well, the organization's learning with you. And like you say, they may not have known this as to where the gaps are and what the priority of the gaps are. So if you have some thoughts about how we can make this inherent in our reliability processes to do gap assessments and or successes or questions about it, please reach out to us.
Yep. And you can do that over at accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. A couple ways you can get in touch with us. And there's also Carl and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. Just last week, I got a question through LinkedIn, which was about sample size for accelerated testing. And I got a direct email saying, why are there so many accelerated life test models? And so I don't know if that was prompted from an episode that we did the week prior that was about accelerated testing, but I certainly appreciate it. And I look forward that we don't have a gap of no questions after this episode. So
absolutely. Well said, Fred.
All right. Thanks, Carl. I'll talk to you again soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Cheers. Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.